Baylor cannot win with one and dones. I think it's an interesting point. And I started to think about it. I thought about it a lot on the drive home from Memphis, as a matter of fact. And let me start by saying this. I say Baylor should have a new team building approach. By no means is that saying Scott Drew is not a good coach. No, that's not true. Okay. He's a very good coach. He's a Hall of Fame coach. And I trust him with building a team a new way, which he's done before to great effect. Okay, so that's the first one. And then the second one is when I'm looking at the one and dones and how that fits into the team. Let me start by saying this. There, by no means is that an indictment on Jacoby Walter. It's not an indictment on Yves Missi. It's not an indictment on Jeremy Sohan. It's not an indictment on Keontae George or Kendall Brown. None of that. I'm not saying those players can't help you win a championship. Not what I'm saying. But I think it's an interesting point to think of how Baylor has shifted towards one and dones being in very important roles for the team since the national championship victory. I mean, each of the last 3 years, they have had at least one starter being a one and done freshman. It was Kendall Brown in 22, and obviously Sohan was the sixth man of the year in the lottery pick. Keontae George last year, and you had two this year, and Walter and Missi. Okay? But I think there is validity to the point that college basketball is not in that mode anymore where you can have two or three supremely talented freshmen in your starting lineup and go and win a national championship. In fact, that era is over. It's been over for a while. To me, there's only been two teams in college basketball that have truly embraced it like the one and done teams. Teams that have two or three guys in their starting lineup and that are their key players, are their engines, and win a championship. Those two teams that played the one and done ball and won the national championship were 2012 Kentucky and 2015 Duke. So the last one was almost 10 years ago. 2012 Kentucky, they had Anthony Davis, they had Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, the first two picks in the draft, and a couple of other guys too that were highly recruited, five-star freshmen, and one went on to become an NBA superstar. 2015, Duke, starting lineup, had Jahlil Okafor, Justice Winslow, and Final Four MOP Tyus Jones. Three freshmen in there. And those teams were able to overwhelm with talent. Now, I would again look at the Duke team and say, well, the other two starters were seniors who had played well over 100 games for Duke before going into that season. That was Emil Jefferson and Quinn Cook. So there is the need for senior leadership in there as well. But we have surpassed the one and done era in college basketball. To me, that was about 2010 to maybe 15 or 16. And, 2010, Kentucky was the big team most of the year, right? John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins. Well, they lost in the Elite Eight. They lost to a West Virginia team that had a bunch of seniors like Joe Mazzulla and Deshaun Butler. And that team lost to Duke that won the national championship. You might remember it because they beat Baylor. That had three seniors and two juniors starting. So, okay, that's not it. The next year it's UConn, right? And they had a junior in Kemba Walker, a senior in Alex Oriaki. They didn't have a one and done guy. 2012, it's Kentucky. And they beat a team with another one and done in Thomas Robinson. So there you go. There's one. 2013, Louisville, although if you look at the record books, it's nobody, was not a one and done team. They had a bunch of juniors and seniors on that team. Okay. 2014, who won it that year? UConn. All kinds of juniors and seniors, including Shabazz Napier, of course, that beat another one of those one and done Kentucky teams in the Final Four. 2015, you had two powerhouses the whole year. It was Kentucky with Karl Anthony Towns, and it was Duke. And Wisconsin with senior Frank Kaminsky beat Kentucky, lost to Duke. And since then, there has not been a one and done team that has won a national championship. In fact, there's really only been one team that I can think of that's had any one and dones that won the national championship. And that was the kid from Carolina. I'm forgetting his name right now. He was the center in 2017, and it was Tony Bradley. Tony Bradley was his name. 2017 Carolina had Tony Bradley, who did not start for them and went late in the first round of the NBA draft. But if you think of that Carolina team, you are not thinking of Tony Bradley. I guarantee it. You're thinking of like Justin Jackson and those guys. And Bryce Johnson, is that it? Something like that. So all that to say, the teams that have won national championships in the last decade are not dependent on one and done guys. And if you look at that Baylor 2021 team, that is absolutely the case. Okay. They did not have a single one and done. And in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, they did not have a single freshman that was a real contributor to that team. LJ Cryer was on the bench. He was a reserve. He was not part of the real rotation yet. But you look at like Jonathan Chamachachua was in his first year, but he wasn't a freshman. Matthew Meyer was a sophomore, or a junior. So they did not have a one and done guy. They didn't have freshmen leading the way. And this is what I mean by kind of the fine margins of how we judge a season. Because Jacoby Walter and Yves Missi were fantastic for this team this year. And I wouldn't trade either one of them for most guys in the country. But it's not about them so much as it is the entire team. I look at the teams that are still in it. UConn and Houston, the two front runners. And for me, Houston is my national champion pick. Those guys have played together for years. I get LJ Cryer just came into Houston, but that's a guy who's played on a national championship team, comes in and is kind of the missing piece. But the rest of those guys, they played for years, man. Juwan Roberts and Jamal Shedd and this whole UConn team, basically, they've played together. And that is what is winning in college basketball again. We had a very short stint where one and dones were what got you to the Final Four or won you a national championship. That's not there anymore. And it's not on any one guy. But it sure is valid enough that you need to rethink how we are building this team. Because for the third time in 4 years, Baylor is going to need to replace 4 starters, most likely. 4 starters. And that is just as good as your coaching can be. And it is really good here at Baylor, not just Scott, but all the way on down. And as good as your culture is, and as good as the guys you bring in from the portal, that is not a recipe for success. It's about bringing guys in and having great senior leadership and having them play together. For me, that is what wins you games. That's what gets you to the Final Four. And that's what keeps us from having tough episodes like we had the last couple of days, personally.